Shimmer. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, I think I know that for sure. Long.
Like I say, George is supposed to be my God damn.
I think a lot of people.
Hi. Nice to see you.
It's good to see everyone, but different circumstances.
Hey, how you doing, man? We're all together again. Can't avoid this guy. That's a good point. Let's do that.
Mark, nice to meet you. Tony, yeah, it's been the wedding last time. We talked about it.
I haven't seen her either.
So later that night, he's grading the test. He goes, I can't believe this. They're getting 100. I can't believe it. It was, anyway.
He said you have used the best board I've ever had.
This is Sister Oxley and Lorna.
Oh my God, how are you?
See each other so soon again.
I didn't know until after that morning.
Oh.
Right after that morning. That it was not.
And now we can assure you. I would love it. Right on, George.
Good morning, friends. My name is Craig Brown. I served as the pastor of this church from 2013 to 2018. And on behalf of the members and friends of the First United Methodist Church of San Diego, I want to welcome you to this great celebration of one of the grandest members of this congregation, George Mitrovich. To know George was to really know proximity. Because if you were close to George, you were close to a lot of other people at the same time. And this was one of the great joys of knowing George. Not just the people George knew, which he made sure everyone knew who he knew, but the fact that George just didn't know people of notoriety. George was one of the most egalitarian people I ever met. He was as deeply engaged with political leaders and religious leaders as he was with busboys in a restaurant, flight attendants on a plane. In the very last conversation I had with George at the end of May, we had a lengthy conversation with our server in a restaurant, all because he simply asked, What's your story? The proximity about George that we celebrate this day is all of the richness of those human relationships. But we also celebrate the most important proximity of all in George's life. And that was his proximity to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. What a dear, dear disciple George was. And we celebrate and witness to that this very day. And so we begin this celebration by hearing these words to orient ourselves around George's life in devotion to Christ. In dying, Christ destroyed our death, and in rising, Christ restored our life. Christ will come again in glory. As in baptism, George put on Christ, so in Christ may George forever be clothed with glory. Here and now, dear friends, we are God's children. We know that we have not yet fully seen who we will become. But we know that when He, Jesus, appears, we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. Those who have this hope purify themselves as Christ is pure. Jesus Himself said, I am the resurrection and I am the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, yet shall they live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I hold the keys of hell and death. Because I live, you also shall live. My dear friends, we've gathered here today to praise God and to witness to our faith as we celebrate the life of George Mitrovich. We come together in grief, acknowledging our human loss. May God grant us grace, that in pain we may find comfort, in sorrow, hope, and in death, resurrection. I would invite all of you now to please turn in the blue Methodist hymnal in front of you to page number 378, as we stand together and sing Amazing Grace, verses 1, 2, 3, and 6. You may be seated. Let us pray. Eternal God, we praise you for the great company of all those who have finished their course in faith and now rest from their labor. We praise you for those dear to us, whom we name in our hearts before you. Especially, we praise you for your servant George Sherman Mitrovich, whom you have graciously received into your presence. To all of these give light. Grant your peace. Let that perpetual light shine upon them, and help us so to believe where we have not seen, that your presence may lead us through our years and bring us at last with them into the joy of your home, a home not made with hands, but eternal in the heavens, through Jesus Christ our Lord. And together all God's people said, Amen.
Last night I lay a-sleeping, there came a dream so fair. I stood in old Jerusalem, beside the temple there. I heard the children singing, and ever as they sang, methought the voice of angels from heaven answering, methought the voice of angels from heaven answering. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, lift up your gates and sing, Hosanna in the highest, Hosanna to your King. And then methought my dream was changed, the streets no longer rang. Hushed were the glad hosannas, the little children sang. The sun grew dark with mystery, the morn was cold and chill, as the shadow of a cross arose upon a lonely hill, as the shadow of a cross arose upon a lonely hill. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, hark how the angels sing, Hosanna in the highest, Hosanna to your King. And once again the scene was changed, new earth there seemed to be. I saw the holy city beside the tideless sea. The light of God was on its street, the gate was open wide. that would not pass away. It was the New Jerusalem that would not pass away. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, sing for the night is o'er. Hosanna in the highest, Hosanna forevermore. Hosanna in the highest,
This morning we'll hear two readings of poetry by Dick Flavin, Billy Trengethi, if they would both join me here in the chancel as we hear the words that they've prepared.
How did you and George first meet? Did he greet you on the street? Perhaps you waited on his table or had a friend within his stable. Or was it at a speaker's forum which he led with such decorum? Did you read his baseball notes or Facebook blogs with all those quotes? Whatever way your lives did blend, this is a fact. You had a friend. He loved us all with his great heart. He raised friendship into an art. He cared for everything, you see. Well, maybe not the GOP. This much is certain. Among men, we shall not see his like again. So let us bid him fond adieu. So long, George. We love you too.
The last baseball poem for George Mitrovich by Tim Peeler. 6 emails and a microphone, a dialogue with a civil tone. Governors and court justices like cathedrals with soaring buttresses. The Saxon Old Fenway, number 42, gone away. Frequent flyer fellowship, a trusty phone, an Intel chip. The smile, the laugh, the glass of red, the gentle nod, and the things he said. For friends who treasure the times they've known, for those lucky many, the game plays on.
And now we shall hear 2 passages of Scripture from the 23rd Psalm, read by Carl Backus, and some selected passages from John 14 by Dave Keeney.
The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen.
Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way to the place where I am going. I will not leave you orphaned. I am coming to you. In a little while the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Because I live, you also will live. I have said these things to you while I am still with you. But the Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything and remind you of all that I have said to you. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid.
We're gathered together here this morning to praise God and to give our thanks to God for the gift of the life of George Mitrovich, for what he meant to his family and to his friends, for what he meant to this city and its institutions, and for what he meant to our nation and its well-being. George and Laverle joined this church in 1973, and over the past 46 years, George rarely missed a Sunday, and when he did, it was usually because he was on a plane flying to Denver or Boston or Washington, D.C. in order to conduct a forum. George didn't start out as a Methodist. He was raised in the Nazarene Church here in San Diego and nourished a fond affection for that church for the rest of his life. In fact, he was educated by the Nazarenes at Pasadena Nazarene College, and that's where he met Laverle and married her 62 years ago and raised 3 children, Carolyn and Mark and Tim. The grandchildren are here as well, Carolyn's son Matthew, and Tim's family, his wife Lisa, and their children Jessica and Juliet. In the 1970s, Pasadena Nazarene relocated in San Diego in Point Loma and became Point Loma Nazarene University. And George continued as a friend of the college, and just a few years ago, they awarded him with an honorary doctorate, but his church membership was here with the Methodists. George had a deep interest in religion. He read theology, he read church history, especially English history in the 18th century, which is where Methodists trace their origin. He had friends in many denominations, some of whom are here this morning. Let me mention Bishop Chain, who is here in the chancel, who is participating. He was the presiding bishop of the Diocese of Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he was the dean of the Cathedral of St. Paul here in San Diego. Bishop Chain made possible one of the great moments in George's life when he invited George to preach at the National Cathedral in Washington. Jim Wallace is also here as one of the speakers this morning. Dr. Wallace is the founder of the Sojourners Community, editor of Sojourners Magazine, and occasional speaker at the City Club. These are 2 prominent national church leaders that George called friend, but there are a whole lot of them. I reckon that George had an ecclesiastical network that if they ever brought together, they would be as admirable as the Vatican Council. But instead, George was here in this church every week, engaged in the life of this local church. He was a member here as a Methodist, but he cared little about denominational differences. What he cared about was making the world a better place, and he was attracted to men and women who were seriously involved in doing that. He believed the true mission of the church is to proclaim the good news of redemption, which means that we can be better than we are, and the world can be more like the way God created it to be. A world where people help others in need, where prodigals are welcomed home, and where we gather at the same table with those who are supposed to be enemies, and where foreigners and strangers are welcomed as brothers and sisters. That's the religion that George believed in. That's the religion that guided his life, that determined his values, and that shaped his lifelong vocation. And so for that reason, we gather here to celebrate and to give thanks for his life. The Bible not only gives us a picture of what the world was created to be, it also gives us a vision of another grander world where our lives are fulfilled in a life beyond this one. And that vision is captured in the two scripture readings that you just heard read this morning. From the Hebrew Bible, the familiar 23rd Psalm, which is called a pilgrim song, sung by the people journeying to the temple in Jerusalem for high holy feast days. And it pictures God as a shepherd safely guiding us to our destination through green pastures, that's the good times of life, and through also the dark paths and valleys of our lives, such as George traveled in these last weeks. In all seasons of our life, the Lord is our shepherd. The shepherd metaphor is a beautiful one, but the 23rd Psalm has another metaphor that is also appropriate. It pictures God as a host at a banquet. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. That's an image of hospitality. And that banquet image is used elsewhere in the Bible, most notably in Isaiah's vision of the end of history, where God will prepare a banquet on Mount Zion, a feast for all peoples, a feast of fat things, a feast of wine on the lees, well refined. And you find the same image of hospitality at the end of the journey in the Gospel of John, which you heard read as well. The scene is Jesus' farewell speech to his disciples. And Jesus says, in my Father's house are many dwelling places, and I go to prepare a place for you. And in both readings, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's the same image of hospitality and welcoming, which is so appropriate for George. And it means that George is now right at home, because hospitality and welcoming was a part of his being. I could see him arriving in heaven, giving St. Peter some suggestions on how to improve the heavenly banquet. But I can also see him dressed to the nines, as he always was, greeting the guests. Only he wouldn't greet you, just greet you. He would tell you also where you should sit. He's still doing that now at the heavenly banquet. He'd seat the baseball players newly arrived in heaven at the tables in front with Jackie Robinson. The politicians, the ones who made it to heaven, there are a lot of politicians in the room today. They'd get the next best tables. And then the rest of us, he'd remember all the rest of us by name. All those people that he met on the plane, those people that he met at the checkout line at Vaughn's supermarket, or at the next table at Starbucks. or in the neighborhood, common folk that he would meet and thereafter call friend. They'd be given the same special attention that he gave his old friends, the celebrities. That's the way he was. That's the way he is now. And that's the way he will always be. He's George. So we give thanks to God for the gift of his life and the gifts that George gave to our lives. Amen. And now we'll continue celebrating his life with memories from his friends and family, and we'll begin with his daughter, Carolyn. You want to just, she's not going to stand there.
So hello, everyone. There's a lot of people here. We have a lot of people who are going to talk about my dad today, but they're going to talk about George Mitrovich. I'm going to talk about the man I first knew as Daddy, then as Dad, and then as I got older, often as George. I'm the first of the 3 children and the only girl, and I was an only child for 5 years, and my father was my best friend. He took me everywhere with him. We spent a lot of time in bookstores, which is where I lay my love of reading. He took me to Dodger Stadium and carried me over the turnstile so I could get in for free. I don't know if that's still a thing or not. He took me a lot of places with him, regardless of the fact that I, at the time, and still am, a big tattletale. And I loved nothing better. He had a reputation for running out of gas all the time, of running into the house and telling my mom, "Mommy, guess what? Daddy ran out of gas again." He played with me and chased me, watched cartoons with me, and taught me a very important life lesson that I passed on to my son. Cereal is meant to be eaten before you go to bed. As kids, when we moved back to Washington, D.C., we've driven across the country 10 times. 10 times. Driving with my dad was always a really interesting experience because it was all about the destination. So we whizzed by the Painted Desert, we whizzed by Mount Rushmore, we whizzed by everything, and we rarely stopped, even when we wanted to, even when the bathroom was a really needed stop. Then he found photography. Once my dad started taking pictures when we were driving anywhere, he'd see a rock formation, and we would sit there in the car while my dad took pictures for a very long time. As you all know, my dad loves sports, and I, not a sports person, grew up learning to throw a football and swing a bat. My dad took his sports very seriously, and I'm sure many of you here participated in the Mitrovich Memorial softball game. I stopped playing in that game several years ago, actually before my son was even born, because I am notoriously a bad catcher and a bad thrower. So whatever team I was on, I was always out in right field. So my father, the switch hitter, got up to bat on the opposite team, and he hit left-handed right to me. His team won that game. Being George's daughter was always interesting when people would ask me, like they'd hear his name and they'd say, "What is it your father does?" So in my office, I'm notorious for one time somebody asking me, and I said, "Just Google him." It was always a really hard thing to explain to people exactly what my dad did. Of all the things that I learned from my father was, number one, he loved me unequivocally, with no strings attached, regardless of what happened in my life. He also taught me by his actions to be true to myself, to be the person that I am and not the person that other people expect me to be or wanted me to be. I am who I am, however odd some people may think that is, because of my father, because of my dad, George. He showed me how to be me. There's one thing I want to say before I leave, and I hope I'm not running over my 3 minutes. The last couple months, and especially the last 3 weeks of my dad's life, was very, very difficult. And my father nor my family would not have gotten through it if it wasn't for my brother Mark. He was absolutely there every minute of every day and tireless in his taking care of my father and seeing that he got what he needed. So, thank you, brother.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Marston, and I am a friend of George. George Mitrovich was a very organized fellow. When Mark first called and said that his dad's health had taken a downward turn, I asked about coming over to visit, phone calls, things like that, and Mark said, sure, that'd be great. So I called George, and he answered the phone, hello, Mr. Marston. Hi, George. How are you doing today? Oh, I'm all right. Okay, so here's the deal. My services are going to be at First United Methodist, and you are going to be one of the speakers. In case anyone's wondering what I'm doing up here with all these luminaries. It's like my mom used to say, orders from headquarters. 5 years ago, a group of us, the friends of George, FOGs, threw a surprise birthday party for him for his 79th. And people asked us, that's kind of odd, 79, why 79? What happened at 80? Well, it's a surprise party, people. George is expecting something on his 80th. So we went to find a place to do it, and we picked the parking lot at the stadium. We had a great committee, Percival, Katz, McAllister, Maggie Brown. Of course, Mark was the point guy. And fabulous, and we needed some space, and we needed some chairs and a couple of microphones, and we went to the city for permits and permission, and you'd have thought we were planning Woodstock 2. And the irony, of course, was that all we had to do was pick up the phone and call George, and George would have taken care of it in 5 minutes. We couldn't do that. So now we needed a foil, and so Kevin McGarry, who is a teammate of George's on the Mets, shared the same birthday. He's assistant football coach at San Diego State. So I went to George and I said, okay, so here's the deal. The San Diego State football team wants to throw a surprise party for Kevin, and they'd like you to be the master of ceremonies. And George said, ooh, okay, I'll do that. Of course, the irony here is that the San Diego State football team is probably the only group in the entire region that would have no idea who George Mitrovich is. So then the next battle was getting him there. And I was terrified of screwing this up and spilling the beans as I'm driving. And so the Republican Jersey boy, Yankee fan light bulb goes off in my head. And I figure, oh, this is easy. I'll just trash talk the Red Sox and Democrats, and we'll take care of this all the way to the stadium. And it worked really well. And we were coming into the parking lot, and there's this, big crowd. Ooh, this is a nice turnout. Kevin must have a lot of friends. I said, well, yeah, George, you're not the only one that's got a lot of friends. He goes, well, yeah. And so we pull into the parking space, and he goes, look, Katz and Percival are here. What are they doing here? I didn't know they knew Kevin. Well, George, you're not the only one, Katz and Percival. I don't know what to do. Oh, yeah, well. He gets out of the car. He can see Mets teammates flipping hamburgers. He hears surprise, and he realizes what the deal is. And he's speechless. Ever see that from George Mitrovich? And it was a great, great time. One of the greatest memories I have about anything. George Mitrovich played on the Mets baseball team for 20 years in the San Diego Adult Baseball League. Let me make this very clear. This is not, some older guy wussy softball league. This is baseball. Although you had great times at the Memorial Softball. I thought about that as you were saying that, but and he was a good ball player, and he let everybody know it. And I'd go to these city club meetings, and he'd talk about how I went 3 for 4. There's my manager, Jeff, out there. Right, Jeff? I went 3 for 4. And the fish story would get larger every once in a while, but I let it slide. But he could hit. And if we needed to put the ball in play, he was one of the 2 or 3 top guys in the team that would put the ball in play. We can't afford a strikeout. And he could bunt. Anybody remember bunting? Nobody bunts anymore. George could bunt, and about every 3rd or 4th time on a sacrifice, he'd beat it out and drive the other team crazy. And he'd sit in the corner of the dugout holding court on politics, or he's looking at the Red Sox game or the Padre game or something, and he's driving me nuts. George, you're on deck. Get going. Oh, okay, whatever. And he always came through. And he always knew what he was doing. And he was a great teammate. And we would go afterwards to get something to eat. And we went one day to DeMillie's, and Mark Alvey and J.D. Crow were sitting there with a pen kind of silently going like this on the placemat thing. About a 50-minute lunch, 27 names dropped. And not, 16 of the same names, but 27 different names. So we had a new nickname for George, Thud, the sound of another name being dropped. But most of the time, we went to some fast food place. He loved Jack in the Box. I always wondered if the family had stock in Jack in the Box. McDonald's is right across the street. No, we're going to Jack in the Box, Jack in the Box. And he'd get in his car and he'd take off, and the rest of the team would go, I guess we're going to Jack in the Box. It was like Pied Piper. Everybody followed George. And we'd have a good time at Jack in the Box. And then every Sunday, after the game, as has been mentioned many times, and will be mentioned, I'm sure, a few times again, he'd just get up and he'd go to some family in another part of the place, Jack in the Box, and he'd go up to the children. Hi, I'm George. What's your name? And you watch the parents, and they're like, what's this guy doing with our kids? But then they'd realize that he was serious, that he was one of those genuine people you'd ever know. And he was interested in every person, no matter where they were on the ladder of life. He was interested, and he cared. And to me, he was a second father and a second older brother all rolled into one. There'll never be another one like him. And I was going to end with some sort of traditional rest in peace, Brother George. But that ain't going to happen. There's no rest for George Mitrovich. He's up there running around. He's organizing things. He's looking down going, Marston's going on too long. Well, I learned that from you. And he's going to be looking in on the game tonight. His 2 favorite teams playing. Kathleen, he's had a few conversations with your dad already. And tomorrow night, when everything is sort of calmed down, he's going to be in a pickup game. And he's going to line a single to center off of the great Cy Young. How do you get into a pickup game against the great Cy Young? Thud has connections. George, thank you for your friendship and your love and the legacy you've left all of us. And may the God who you so faithfully served bless and keep you in heaven. Amen.
I am Bob Nichols from Denver, and rather than try and sum up my relationship with George, like all the other orators, I thought I would try to do it in his words and read from some baseball notes that he wrote at the first game of the World Series last year. Anybody who received the baseball notes knows it's impossible to pick any out. And secondly, that baseball notes were ostensibly about baseball that would carry on, however, all the wide range of subjects that George loved to talk about. And so here it is, World Series notes, Wednesday, October 24th. Tension high, temperature cold, time frozen. Thus began the 2018 World Series between the Dodgers of Los Angeles and the Red Sox of Boston. The last time they did this in a World Series was 1916. but the Dodgers were the Robins of Brooklyn and played in Ebbets Field, but the Red Sox were still the Red Sox and played during the regular season at Fenway Park, opened in 1912. In Game 2 of the series, the pitcher for Boston was Babe Ruth, and the 21-year-old left-hander pitched all 14 innings as the Sox won 2-1. It was a brilliant performance by the Babe at Braves Field, witnessed by 47,000. The Red Sox would win that series 4-1. The Robins' only win coming at home when they won at Ebbets in Game 3, 4-3. Last night at Fenway, the Red Sox won over the Dodgers 8-4, as Boston scored twice in the first inning against Clayton Kershaw, but LA came back to tie at 2-2, and then 3-3 against Chris Sale, before the Sox moved 2 up at 5-3 and then 5-4. But in the bottom of the 7th, due to a Dodger pitching change, Eduardo Nunez hit for Rafael Devers. There were 2 outs and 2 runners on when Alex Wood delivered his second pitch, a knee-high fastball on the inside corner of the plate. Nunez swung mightily, and the ball rose like an RPG towards the monster seats in straightaway left field, as a man seated in the first row reached for the ball, wisely thought better of it, and pulled his hand back just in time to keep from losing it, as the ball slammed into the divide between the seats and the light tower. Thus did the breathing habits of the Fenway crowd return to a normal pattern. But never wanting to miss a chance at raising Red Sox Nation anxiety, Alex Cora did it again. He went to the bullpen at the top of the 9th and brought in Craig Kimbrell. Oh my God, not Kimbrell. You can't be serious, Alex, we serious fans seriously thought, but here he came, the red-birded one with a scarecrow stance at the ready. But of course, we serious fans ask, when was the last time he was at the ready? Against the pathetic O's at Camden in August, maybe? Or did he blow that save too? But Mr. Cora, the freshman manager, had heard Eric Gagne, once a closer for Boston and the Red Sox, had told someone that Kimbrell's problem were that he was tipping off his pitches. The manager believed that might be the source of his closer's peril of Pauline performances, and if he stopped signaling the pitches he was throwing, we might see the old Kimbrell. Viola. The Kimbrell we saw versus LA was the Kimbrell we saw when he first came to the Sox from the San Diego Padres when he was lights out. Up came Pedersen, Muncy, and Turner. Down went Pedersen, Muncy, and Turner. The old Kimbrell was back. Lastly, Game 1 took 3 hours and 52 minutes to play. When Babe Ruth beat the Robins back in 1916 in 14 innings, Game 2 was 2 hours and 33 minutes. Just saying. Thank you.
I'm Donna Cohen, best known by George as DC. DC, I need you to be in Chicago. Dr. Charles can't make it, something's come up. You'll be on the panel. You'll be terrific. We both knew that no one takes the place of Dr. Charles very easily, and there may have been many people on that list ahead of me. But one thing George knew, and I knew, was that the answer was, of course, yes. No questions asked. DC, I need you in San Diego, the All-Star Game luncheon. Peter Gammons can't make it. I'll put you on the panel. You'll be terrific. And yes, we both knew I probably wasn't the #1 choice to take the place of Peter Gammons, but we also both knew that it was a yes, no questions asked. Oh, and by the way, can you pick up Tim Kirchin? He needs a ride from the studio. He's recording, and he's on a tight schedule. DC, I'd like you to be a eulogist, to be sorted after my demise. I cherish the day we met, and every day since. The outcome is dire, but I am resolute, and it was a yes, no questions asked. George, I thank you for your friendship. I thank you for every friend I have made because of your friendship. Laverne and all of the Mitrovich family, it will always be a yes, no questions asked.
Well, yes, Donna, he told us both to be here. Yes, no questions asked. I thought that it would please George to no end to be mentioned in the same sentence with Jackie Robinson. There, I just did it. But the story goes further, because when we were blessed to live in San Diego, Larry Lucchino and I, and so many of us with the San Diego Padres, we arrived in 1995. And in 1997, we were approached by the head of the Jackie Robinson Family YMCA, a gentleman named Michael Brunker, who we had met back in 95 when he was with the Police Athletic League. And he told us that with the 50th anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier approaching, he wondered if the Padres would help him plan a fundraising dinner, which we were happy to do. Now, that's the only Jackie Robinson Family YMCA in the country. Now, this was before number 42 was retired, way before the movie, and before April 15th was Jackie Robinson Day. And as this event was coming to fruition, there was some publicity, and on television here in San Diego, a news reporter interviewed an 11-year-old girl in a woman on the street interview and said, "Do you know who Jackie Robinson was?" And she said, "Well, I've heard of her, but I don't know exactly what she did." And our reaction is universal, it is human, it is typical. But after we chuckle, I remember realizing that the sadness that it meant Jackie Robinson's name was dying. It had been 25 years since he had passed away, and here we were coming up on the 50th anniversary. Well, the fundraiser went beautifully, and we started to commemorate Jackie Robinson's life here in San Diego. And concurrently, our lives were enriched and impacted by, of course, dear George. Now, one of Jackie Robinson's most famous quotes is that a life is not important except for the impact it has on other people's lives. And here comes George storming into our lives, impacting us in life-enriching, enhancing, and altering ways. And when we got to the Boston Red Sox, where the story of Jackie Robinson very badly needed to be told, George jumped in with both feet. And one day he proclaimed, as he would do, "We are going to see to it that Jackie Robinson gets the Congressional Gold Medal." Okay, knock yourself out. I don't know how to do that, but nor was that my life's goal. But it became his charge, self-appointed, his passion. And I know that there are people in this room, I know Billy Tranghese was instrumental and a number of others, and he just was going to be relentless. And because of that egalitarian nature that we have heard of, he was able to connect the dots from those of us who were ordinary lovers of baseball to those who could actually make something happen. And so on March 2nd, 2005, there we were in the rotunda of the Capitol. George's work had reached this point, and there was Rachel Robinson, there was Sharon Robinson, her daughter, there was President Bush, 43, there was Jesse Jackson, there was Larry Lucchino, there was an array of people from all persuasions, all backgrounds, all political views, united once again thanks to Jackie Robinson and thanks to George Mitrovich. So isn't it wonderful that he not only did this, but that the life that he impacted in this case was the life, or were the lives, of Jackie Robinson's own family. He was able to influence the lives of Jackie Robinson's family, and for that to come full circle, I think, is one of so many of his life achievements. That impact that he's had on all of us has led, as Donna mentioned, to some of the most wonderful, treasured, important friendships in our lives. So many of my dearest friends I met because of George, and because of George's way of just kind of breaking through inertia and bringing about change. And one that I think is worth noting today is that when he created the Committee of 2000, when he walked into our offices, we didn't know who he was, and said, "I am George Mitrovich, and I believe that your idea," not mine, but Larry's, "for a new downtown ballpark is going to be the most important and transformational event in the history of our downtown, and I've lived here all my life." He said, "And I am going to put together a civic group, independent from you, that will lead the charge." And we're like, okay. Go right ahead. "I will not take a penny from you, for I must remain independent." Well, that would go well at our budget meetings, so that's fine. And as he started to round up the citizens, there was a young lady who I don't know that I've seen for many years, named Barbara Daly, and she said, "Well, you know, if this is going to happen, it's going to be the women of 2000 who make it happen." And she convened 30 women at our Padres offices. Well, one of those women turned out to be a young woman from Baltimore, where I'm from. Turned out she lived 9 houses away from me, even though we didn't know each other. We knew all the same people in common. Well, we became friends, and I met her husband and her kids, and we shared the stories of how amazing it was that we grew up 9 houses away from each other in Baltimore, and now both lived here in San Diego. And she says, "You have to meet my best friend." And we had breakfast, and then we had dinner, and then Larry Lucchino had dinner with her, and she's seated by his side because they're now husband and wife. That's Stacy Lucchino. So the impact that George had is not only measured in the direct impact, but in the repercussions. And I guess it's for us to continue to propagate that love, propagate that goodness, meet people, be not afraid to meet people, and to ask them, "What's your story?" So all of us are here together in love, thanks to George, and we know that he is treasuring what a wonderful turnout it is as he sits there and says to Jackie Robinson, "I got you that Congressional Gold Medal." Thank you. Let me turn it over now to Larry Lucchino.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Larry Lucchino, and I'm going to use my few short minutes today to also celebrate our friend, the distinctive, inimitable, eloquent, ubiquitous, social justice-seeking, baseball-loving, hand-kissing, name-dropping, one-of-a-kind force of nature, George Mitrovich. This gigantic crowd, for those of you who can't tell, this church is full, and a variety of speakers, 17 at last count. Now we're more than halfway through, so relax. Each with quite specific time limits, demonstrates that in death, as in life, George is still orchestrating. He is still the leader of the band. When I first came to the San Diego Padres in 1995, I had the great good fortune to meet George, inevitably. In 1997 and 98, we put in an initiative, Prop C, on the local ballot to build a new downtown ballpark and to revitalize a portion of downtown San Diego that needed serious help. George was a key to our success with his passionate advocacy and his formation of the Committee of 2000. When I asked him who the 2000 were, he replied, "Oh, they are my closest friends here in town." When many of us here today moved to Boston with the Red Sox purchase in 2002, George approached me with the idea of the Great Fenway Park Writers Series. At first I was reluctant, but we all know what George's, shall we call it, knack of persuasion. And in this case, he was right. The Great Fenway Writers Series was and continues to be a big success in Boston. Not sure if and how it will continue. Like John Wooden, Tony Gwynn, and others, George is irreplaceable. George epitomized the words of President John Kennedy, doubtless another one of George's 2000 close friends, who once said, "One man can make a difference and everyone should try." George made a difference everywhere he went. When George started running the Fenway Park Writers Series, I succumbed to giving him a Red Sox credential to wear around his neck. Is there anyone here today who didn't know George had a Red Sox credential? Be honest. Anyone who flew on the same plane with George knows he wore it through security as if he were Ted Williams, another one of his 2000 friends. When the turnout at a writer's series might appear to be underwhelming, George would invite the pilots and the crew of the current flight to Boston. There are now more Alaska Airlines employees that are Red Sox fans than there are Mariner fans in that company in Seattle. George's important work for the Red Sox as ambassador of our Jackie Robinson events, our community initiatives, his writers series, his work in Boston, Washington, Denver, and San Diego did not go unnoticed or unrewarded. I was proud to lead the charge to award George a World Series ring in 2013 and again in 2018 for his valuable contributions to the Red Sox. So, let me ask again, is there anyone here that didn't know George had a World Series ring? Have you been living on a desert island in the South Pacific? I think if there was something in life he wanted you to know, you knew it. George was exceptionally good and generous and kind to me and to his legion of friends, to the Padres, to the Red Sox, and to San Diego. This community has lost a true son of San Diego, a kind patriot, an engaged and indefatigable citizen. The City Club, the Denver Forum, the Great Fenway Park Writers Series have lost a leader that may not be replaceable. Baseball has lost a vocal, colorful, and spirited advocate for the game. And I have lost, as the Mitrovich family, a dear friend and a personal historian. My life was fuller and more fulfilled with George as a part of it. I'm sure yours was as well. We miss you already, George, and I did it in under 3 minutes.
My name is Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. I think of George as dapper, dashing, chivalrous, a shining knight. Well, maybe a knight who's devoted to baseball rather than jousting. and who rescues nations in need rather than damsels in distress. Had Chaucer known George, he certainly would have included him along with the wife of Bath, for George would have been the center of every pilgrimage, getting along with kings, princesses, fairies and farmers, seniors and senators, waiters and whale hunters, airline attendants, as you heard, taxi drivers, priests, ministers, and rabbis, anyone he met or was within 40 feet of meeting him. He asked questions. Where do you come from? What do you like to do? What do you dream of? Do you have children, brothers, sisters, parents? Are they alive? He not only knew more people than anyone else, he knew more about them. My connection to George was family. He had worked for my father, Robert Kennedy, in the Nebraska primary in 1968, and our bond was ever so tight. Like many, I had spoke for George at the City Club in San Diego, the Denver Forum, the Great Fenway Park Writers Series, and DC. Well, actually not DC, because that was solely based on baseball, but I like to think that I could have spoken there. When I was invited by Major League Baseball's tribute to African American players in Nashville, I immediately called George and asked him to come with me, and he immediately said, yes. We had a blast. He knew everyone, where they had played, when they had played, what their scores were, what their 25 best plays were. I was with an encyclopedia, dressed impeccably in a white linen suit and a Panama hat. When my daughter Maeve decided to move to San Diego, she knew no one. She had been in the Peace Corps in Mozambique and had wanted to live in a place that was warm, near the water, and interesting. And she looked at the map of the United States and she chose San Diego. So, of course, I called George Mitrovich. In his usual determined way, he soon found Maeve a place to live, Hillcrest, a job working for Senator Feinstein. He also found her a bed and a dresser. He got her, the job led to a boyfriend who became a husband and the father of my 3 grandchildren. So just so you know, George knows how to produce. He had my nephew Joe stay at his house when he was first running for Congress while arranging a fundraiser for him. And Joe won. He may come back. George came to Washington, D.C. last June 6th to remember my father. He has been a wonderful part of my family and made me part of his. Thank you, Laverle, Carolyn, Mark, and Tim, for your kindness, thoughtfulness, and generous spirit. You shared your husband and your father, and I am most grateful. One of the aspects that George had in common with my father was his deep faith. When few can speak about their belief in God, he was able to talk and live his faith with enthusiasm. He treated each person as his neighbor. He cared about the least among us. He had enormous curiosity about each person he met because he saw the divine in everyone. I will miss him immensely, and I hope that I will be able to embrace that generous, giving spirit that he embodied every single day of his life. Goodbye, George.
Thank you for all the memories and the sharing, and we look forward to that which is to come. As we do so, I'd invite you to stand, please, and open that blue Methodist hymnal again to page number 117 as we sing, O God, our help in ages past. You may be seated.
Before I began my 3 minutes allotted me, let me read you a brief note that Laverle and her children received. Please accept Jill's and my heartfelt condolences. You and your entire family are in our thoughts and prayers. George was a man of constant integrity and decency, and he was such a passionate and loving husband, father, brother, and friend. Since we first met 48 years ago, I knew him to be loyal and sincere, with an inner compass that drove him to work tirelessly to improve our great nation. Please know that George's remarkable legacy lives on in all those he touched with his dignity and kindness. I will miss my friend. There is a quote that Jill and I cherish that says, "Faith sees best in the dark." May the memories of life's pleasures that you and George proved together give you comfort and strength in the days ahead and the seasons to come. The Honorable Joseph R. Biden. I first would like to recognize our children of our family, of the Mitrovich family. First, George's sister Gloria and her son Marty and wife Vicky. To our brother John and his wife Linda, and their children Milan and Dushan. To our brother Bill and his wife Martha and their children Michelle and Marcy. To our brother Mike and his wife Susie and their children Alexander and Zoe. To my wife Linda and our children Marisa, Heidi, and Jess. I also want to acknowledge the presence of our family friends. That is Colleen and Michael Reagan, the son and daughter-in-law of our 40th President of the United States. And he is part of the GOP. On Wednesday night at the hospital, July 24th, Laverle said, "Daniel, you lost your big brother." And so did Gloria, John, Bill, and Mike. When I was 5 years old, my mother asked Brother George to take me to get a haircut. She also gave him $5 to buy me a cowboy hat. After the haircut, Brother George marched me to the nearest sporting goods store. George knew they didn't sell cowboy hats at sporting goods stores. I told Brother George, "I want a cowboy hat." And he said, "Daniel, you're not going to be a cowboy, you're going to be a baseball player." I never did become a cowboy. But because of Brother George, I played a lot of baseball. And there are many here today that remember the annual Mitrovich games. Years and years and years. Brothers George, John, Bill, Mike, and all of us played. George loved to laugh. One day in Boston in 2004, the DNC sponsored a day at Fenway. As George, then Mayor John Hickenlooper, and I walked onto the field to the center field entrance at Fenway along the warning track toward the third base line. To the amazement of George and I, Mayor Hickenlooper left us and thrust his body into the green monster, falling to the warning track. Getting up, dusted himself off, and saying to us, "I always wanted to know what that felt like." George laughed and laughed and laughed all week. George had a way, as we all know, of setting his mind at something, and when he set his mind, there was no turning back. On page 581 in the book titled Sarge, The Life and Times of Sarge Shriver by Scott Cecil, it talks about a congressional staffer named George Mitrovich, who started and led the draft Shriver movement to place Sarge Shriver on the 1972 Democratic Party ticket as vice president. It says that once, when Mitrovich called Shriver, Shriver declined to take the call, saying he didn't want to interrupt dinner with Rose Kennedy. The next day, George called back. Shriver refused to come off the tennis court. George left an angry message for Sarge. "You tell him, what do you want to be, Wimbledon champion or vice president of the United States?" It didn't matter who you were in life. If George wanted to tell you something, he told you. We all know that George did not take no for an answer. In 1968, George phoned me from Nebraska as he was on the campaign trail working for Senator Robert F. Kennedy. He told me I needed to join the campaign. He gave me instructions of what to do. "Daniel, you need to open a campaign office in El Cajon. You need to set a booth at East County Fair. And when your big brother tells you something, you do it." I staffed the East County Fair with Reen Carpenter, the wife of former astronaut Scott Carpenter, and with E. Barrett Prettyman, Jr., a close Kennedy friend. George, on June 3rd, 1968, told me that a nun from Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church in Barrio Logan had been calling, as they wanted so much for the senator to visit their school and meet the children. George told me, "Go over there, take care of that. Be nice, but there's no way the senator, we can work it into the program." I went over to the Barrio Logan and that Catholic church, and I talked to the nuns, but I noticed a pedestrian overpass that crosses over I-5, now known as Cesar Chavez Parkway. Cesar Chavez, as most of us know, is one of Bobby Kennedy's closest friends. I told the nun to get all the children, get their signs, and fill up that pedestrian crossway. As the motorcade came along there in I-5, Senator Kennedy motioned and told him, "Move this motorcade over and come to a halt right there on the freeway." Bobby Kennedy stood up and waved to all the kids. I tell you this because George told me that it was one of the better times in the campaign. He said, "Daniel, you did a great job. When your big brother tells you you did a great job, it means a lot." Later that day, at the San Ysidro Community Park, George introduced me to Senator Kennedy. Senator Kennedy put his hand on my shoulder and told me in that great Boston accent how much he appreciated my work, but more importantly, how much he loved brother. On June 6th last year, at my Beverly Hills Rotary Club, George spoke as it was the 50th anniversary of us losing Bobby. I introduced my brother, carefully. He instructed me what to say almost. At the conclusion of George's talk, he received a standing ovation. And you should know the Beverly Hills Rotary Club, truly one of the more famous Rotary clubs in the world, they don't do standing ovations, but they gave George one. On July 29th, 5 days after George passed, my friend Sam announced George's passing at the club, and once again, they gave him a standing ovation. He was magnificent that day, telling stories that only George could tell of those days in Nebraska. George touched a lot of lives, as we know, but above all, he loved to converse with people. He brought people together who may have never met, Stacy and Larry. He knew icons, evidenced by the people in this church today. And Brother George shared these iconic friends with others. That was important to George. You need to know this person. And what he would do is walk away and get out of the conversation. George knew the George Plimptons, the Peter Mathesons, the Theodore H. Whites, the Sir Malcolm Muggeridges, the Joseph R. Bidens, the Al Simpsons, the Goodells, the Doris Kearns Goodwins, the Mike Dukakis, the Richard Reeves, the Walter Mondales, the Jimmy Carters, the Gloria Steinems, the Eugene McCarthys, the Mark Hatfields, the Sally Quinns and Ben Bradleys, the David Halberstams, the Marlo Thomases, the Pierre Salingers, the Frank Mankowitzes, the Tom Bradens, and a local band named Simon Cassidy. This past June 15th, George asked me to speak at the City Club of San Diego. He had been asking me, he said, Daniel, you need to do this, you need to do this soon. I did not know why. He said to the crowd that day, after 2,000 events, I finally lost my voice, and he couldn't introduce me. His daughter, Carolyn, stepped in. And I say thanks for blessing us all. I will miss you, big brother, with all my heart. One more thing, dear brother. Happy trails to you until we meet again.
Hi, I'm Erwin Jacobs. When we were cautioned that we should only hold our talks to roughly 3 minutes, I thought that probably wasn't going to be too hard, since just about all the talks I ever had with George, I at most got in 3 minutes worth of the conversation. Now, that probably wasn't all his fault. Unlike most of you here, I'm really no longer a great expert at baseball lore. Indeed, I think I stopped paying great attention when Ted Williams retired. Although I do remember many nights listening to the games from Boston. I lived in New Bedford, Massachusetts, on a great big Philco radio, which occasionally I could hear the game through the static. I was trying to remember when I first met George, and my memory these days is not as clear as it should be, but I think it was back in 1968 when he was a press aide to Senator Kennedy, as has been mentioned, to Bob Kennedy, and we set up a Democratic headquarters on Pearl Street in La Jolla, 1968. For those of you that know that or remember that time period, that was somewhat unusual. But UCSD had come and started, and indeed we even had someone from the art department come and paint a nice sign for the headquarters. Became more involved with George in 2007 after I retired from Qualcomm. And I might note that despite the poem that was read, that I think George's trusty phone toward the end no longer had an Intel chip, but had a Qualcomm chip. Now, 2007 turned out was a very special year. It started with the talks by Mike Dukakis and ended up with a talk by Paul Krugman. And so we got very much into the City Club and became quite interested. And indeed, George approached us about having an event, Joan and I, at our home as a fundraiser for the legal fund of Valerie Plume. You may not remember her name, but her husband, Ambassador Joe Wilson, had come back from Niger and discounted the fact that an effort had been made to buy yellow cake uranium. This was back in the prelude to the Iraq War. And we held that. I do remember, as usual, the great job that George did introducing the subject, the reason for it, and giving us a very good setting. He was just always very expert at that. He even convinced me to give a talk at the City Club a few months later, which of course was always interesting because of the great questions that would come back from the audience. In 2011, I had a request from George to come over and have a meeting at our home. He set it up very well for future meetings because he brought over helpings of lobster rolls, knowing my New England background. And there's nothing better than lobster rolls. So we enjoyed that discussion together. We talked about books. As you can see, he had a great interest in books and in his library, probably a little less about baseball, and then about the City Club, and eventually got down to the finances of the City Club, and perhaps it could use a little bit of help. So we, I think, annually kept having those meetings because how can you resist lobster rolls? I'm going to miss those meetings. I think the last one was just a few months ago. And I'm going to miss George greatly. He was a very good friend, but he was certainly a wonderful addition to this community. And his passing is going to be a real loss for us. But in his memory, hopefully, these talks that he sponsored, the interest of all the people that he had involved will continue, and we will remember him for a long time to come. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I think you probably know where I am on the roster, so I don't have to tell you my name, but it is Malin Burnham. I decided that since I'm number 10, I was told earlier, that I didn't have to tell stories because they'd already been told. But I do have a couple of little comments like that. Baseball. George, after several years of him telling me about all of his baseball greats, I decided it was time to go one up on him and maybe we can get on to other subjects. So I told him, George, I said in my senior year at Point Loma High School, I was a cleanup hitter on our baseball team when one of our three pitchers was Don Larson, the only person who's ever thrown a perfect game in the World Series for the New York Yankees. I never heard about baseball after that. George is one of a kind, for sure. And so I'm going to just give you some kind of bullet points here that as I've collected over the years. First of all, he is by far the most unselfish person, I've ever worked with. Next, he has dealt, as we know, with all types of leaders. Politically, I'm in the minority, but I've always been a very close friend of his, and this goes back many, many years. Obviously, you've already heard about his big ability to connect people and ideas and so on and so forth. And he's the best name dropper that we all know. But you know what? He does that, as we all know, but think about it, to get our attention. And he does. He is so non-traditional that it's his uniqueness, in my opinion, which I labeled many, many years ago, the Mitrovich way. And here's one where he, in my opinion, has again been way ahead of the curve. I describe him to be a crusader for democracy, civility, and kindness. Democracy, civility, and kindness. For the last couple of years, I have been promoting that one, the middle word there, civility, which we need. It's the most important thing, in my opinion, we need in this world. And George was way ahead of me years and years ago talking about civility. As we know, he was a great preacher, both in church and out of church. Yes, he did chair the ballot issue to build Petco Park, which was a great turnaround for downtown San Diego and many other attributes as well. And, of course, his passions for many, many things. And in order to keep my time commitment under 3 minutes, I will just say one more thing. To be sure, we will miss him, but never forget him. Thank you.
A good memorial service should have many things. Memories, of which we have in abundance, maybe a little bit of humor. Yogi Berra used to say, if you don't go to people's funerals, they won't go to yours. And some recognition of the whole in our lives that the deceased has rendered. And I have a reading from Saint Exupéry. Now, many of you either read or were read The Little Prince, and Saint Exupéry, who lost his life fighting the Nazis in the early days of the war, but he was wonderful. And he was a pilot in Africa delivering the mail during the 1920s, when planes were not very good and would often fall down. And he writes, "Thus is the earth at once a desert and a paradise, rich in hidden gardens, gardens inaccessible, but to which the craft will lead us ever back one day or another. Life may scatter us and keep us apart. It may prevent us from thinking very often of one another, but we know that our comrades are out there, where one can hardly say, silent, forgotten, but deeply faithful. And when our paths cross theirs, they greet us with such manifest joy. They shake us gaily by the shoulders. Indeed, we are accustomed to waiting. But bit by bit, nevertheless, it comes over us that we will never again hear the laughter of our friend, that this one garden is forever locked against us. And at that moment begins our true mourning, which, though it may not be rending, it is always bitter. For nothing in truth can replace that companion. Old friends cannot be created out of hand. Nothing can match the treasure of common memories, of trials endured together, of quarrels and reconciliations, and generous emotions. It is idle, having planted an acorn in the morning, to expect that afternoon to sit in the shade of an oak. So life goes on, and for years we plant the seed and we feel ourselves rich. And then come other years when time has done its work and our plantation is made sparse and thin, and one by one our comrades slip away and deprive us of their shade. We have been deprived of the shade of George Mitrovich, but he will live on in our hearts. Thank you.
What a tough series of acts to follow. I met George almost 20 years ago. We had a mutual friend, a guy named Doug Price in Denver. I was just about to become elected mayor. I was almost 50. I'd never run for office in my life. And George patted me on the back and said, "You'll do fine." As I got to know George, I realized he brought together the three basic precepts of a good life that the ancient Greeks discussed and revered: the force of the intellect, the importance of the physical body and contest, and of course the power and ultimate power of the spirit. And George loved where those things came together, why he got so involved with Jackie Robinson and the civil rights movement. He was a great promoter, as has been mentioned. He was perhaps one of the great name droppers of all time. You learn early, if you're just getting into politics, that it's not a bad thing to become befriended by a name dropper. He would often say, "John Hickenlooper is the best governor in the last 50 years. That was as long as Mike Dukakis wasn't around, or Governor Dick Lamb wasn't around." I told him one time the old saw about how politicians and their relationship to politics are so similar to baseball managers and general managers and their relationship to baseball, that they have to, in both cases, they have to be smart enough to learn their game and learn it well, but stupid enough to think it really mattered. George looked at me and said, "That's not funny." His brother Daniel told the story of when I first went into on the outfield of Fenway Park in 2004. In 2008, Denver was hosting the convention, And I was trying to raise $58 million to host that convention. And if you remember, Barack Obama was in a terrible battle with Hillary Clinton, and nobody would give any money to anything to do with that convention until there was a decision. So we were under some pressure, and George volunteered, and you know he's always dropping every name. There had to be a certain level of suspicion among any reasonable person. But he said, why don't I help set up something at Fenway Park? They have a beautiful suite upstairs, and we'll convene some of the CEOs of the large corporations in Boston, and I'll get John Henry and Tom Warner, the owners of the Red Sox, and I'll get Larry Lucchino, and we'll come help you raise some money. All right, George, sure. He reached out, and sure enough, they said that the space would be available. And then George called me 2 days before I was supposed to come out. And we, of course, George being George, we timed it for the evening of a game where the Colorado Rockies would be playing his beloved Red Sox. And he called me 2 days before and said, I've got an idea for you. I don't know if you want to do that. I know you were a fanatic for baseball and a pitcher in high school. Why don't you come out and throw the ceremonial first pitch in Fenway Park? Would you like that? And after I got off the floor and regained my composure, I said, of course. And sure enough, 2 days later, I was in Fenway Park, and we raised a couple $1 million. We had the CEOs in that room, and I went down and walked out on the field after the teams had finished warming up, and I threw out that first pitch. And as a credit to the Red Sox organization, I've never seen anything like this. But by the third inning, a staff person came and gave me an 8x10 colored glossy of me just breaking off that curveball with the green monster in the background. George could do that, and many name droppers, the word is a pejorative because so many people, when they drop names, don't really know the people and don't have the relationship. George did. Now, George's voice, well, I don't think there's anybody here that doesn't have the same urge to hear that voice again. It was like George telling a story. His voice was almost like a carousel. It would go up and down and in and out, the calliope changing in tone. His laugh was reminded me of a loon. Now, they say that the tears are the price we pay for love. And often the tears, in truth, are selfish, and the grief is our loss. And I think that's often true. And my grandfather helped raise me. My father died when I was a kid. My grandfather was 6'3" and about 170 pounds, a lot like George, loved life. He was also a splendid splinter. And my grandfather always insisted that you pay attention in life to the hooters, not the hollerers. And the hoot and the holler, I thought, were the same. No, my grandfather had said, no. The people who holler are generally angry about something and criticizing from the bleachers. The people that hoot are the ones that are actually paying attention and usually getting excited about something. George was a hooter. George, I mean, who are you? Go, you tell him a story and you go, ha! Ha! And when Harry Shearer called me and let me know that George had passed away, and I hadn't quite gotten into the loop yet, and I was sitting with my wife at our kitchen in Denver, and I couldn't speak. And I sat there for a moment, and then I remembered his voice, and I thought, well, I'll call his cell phone just to hear his voice. And I called, and his son answered the phone. And so I just started to cry. And I'm not a crier. I didn't cry when my grandfather died. But I couldn't stop for almost it felt like a half an hour, but it was several minutes. And Well, there was no words, and I'm so grateful for the patience. I finally pulled myself together and just said, I am so sad. I've never had that response before, but I think it is just a reflection of what a monumental person we have lost. Thank you.
Just what George would have loved. What a long and great game this has been. It's the bottom of the ninth. But with all the great hits and stories we've heard, we don't need a walk-off today. We are blessed. Each of us is truly blessed for being together to remember George Mitrovich. It was October 2007. The Red Sox were playing in their first World Series game against the Colorado Rockies at Fenway. I was there with my 9-year-old son, Luke, already an enthusiastic baseball player, standing alongside me in his new Red Sox jersey and hat, cheering the Red Sox players as they ran out of the field. "How did you get these tickets?" asked the man sitting next to Luke. "How did you get these tickets?" Without any hesitation, Luke replied, "I know someone." He did indeed, and asked me yesterday to convey his love and appreciation for George. As now a starting baseball player and a rising senior at Haverford College. Now, how many other people, I was wondering as I flew out here, could say that today? I knew someone. I knew someone, and his name was George Mitrovich. Likely legions, literally legions of people, I was thinking, could say that today. The measure of someone's life, as many have already said, is indeed the impact they had on other people. And countless people would testify today who'd love to be here what impact George had on them. Now, as we've heard, George was, as has been said, a notorious name dropper. And George, look how many times your name got dropped today. I mean, really, good planning, good planning. But as my friend just said, he had a relationship with all the people whose names he dropped. He knew them, and they knew him. And many of those people were working hard to change our country and our world. That's what drew George to them. He was drawn to the ones who he thought were making a difference, not just because they were famous. That wasn't ever enough for him. Many were very influential: authors, journalists, senators, governors, faith leaders. But the others George was drawn to, as has been said in so many of these wonderful stories, were very ordinary and less influential people, especially all the people who serve us every day. So many of us, they serve us all day long, every day, and often go completely unrecognized. But George always paid attention to them, and he told me it was something he learned by watching maybe the most influential person he ever knew, Robert Kennedy. George would stop, just stop, and take the time to always talk to the waiters and waitresses, flight attendants, housekeepers, cab drivers, Uber drivers. What's your name? Tell me your story. And as many of you said, when you're having a meal with George, you're going to meet all the people at the next table, whether you want to or not. And there'll be a selfie at the end with one of them smiling with George, having his Red Sox ring on their finger. Always. Recently, we were at the historic Martin's Tavern in Georgetown, all the history of that place. He loved to have lunch there. The owner comes up, and George tells the owner the history of the place. He did. And all the people he'd eaten with right there. And the guy had to listen. It was a long speech. But George was always especially looking out for students. Always. Interns. Young people trying to figure out their way in the world. Always asking how he could help them. Get them in somewhere. Invite them to whatever event he was going to in the city, or get them Red Sox or Padres tickets. He once called Bobby Kennedy's grandson, Joe Kennedy, and got tickets for a Red Sox game when Joe was too humble to ask for them himself. He told me that several times. But George was never afraid to ask, was he? Ever. For anything he could get for somebody else. You see, to understand George, you had to see that George Mitrovich always wanted to change the world. He really did. And that was the center of both his faith and his politics. And he always tried to put the two together, which we always talked about. He wanted to connect with others he believed were working to change the things that were wrong in the world. And love those who were doing things that would make things better. Why would a baseball man like George be so passionate about Jackie Robinson? All of us who came to speak at the San Diego City Club, Denver Forum, Great Fenway Writers Series, we liked George very much. That's why we came. We didn't have to come. We just liked him. We liked talking to him. We liked listening to him. And we were always humbled and inspired by his always overtly generous and often gargantuan introductions to us. Words we hope to live by afterwards. In the 3-minute stuff, George, you never gave an introduction that was only 3 minutes. Come on. But he'd always say the best things about you that anybody would ever say. And it kept you coming back. George always wanted you to do your best. And he called you to it. Because that's what he thought the world needed. For all of us to do better. And he always encouraged us to do so, often with many ideas of exactly how you should do that. I was a Little League baseball coach for 22 seasons. With both my baseball-loving and playing boys, George would sometimes show up to my practices or games in Washington, D.C. when he was in town, wearing a Red Sox jacket and hat. He would tell my kids that he was a Red Sox scout. And boy, did they play well. Never better. That's what George wanted all of us to do, to play our best so that we could change the world. He wanted all of us, this nation, to talk better, discuss better, to live and act better, to serve justice better, and most of all, to love better. And he acted like he could and should hold us all accountable for doing that. So thank you, George, for always encouraging us to do better. And of course, he always wanted to stay connected. It's true. When he didn't like it when you didn't return his calls right away. And he got mad. And he'd keep calling. I hate when people don't return my calls, he said again and again. I can't imagine the number of people that George Mitrovich stayed in touch with. Try to imagine that. Some of us read his baseball notes every day or read them and will miss them like him. George always asked me how my son Luke was doing in baseball. So one day he put in his short hops a story about Luke hitting a game-winning home run and reported in his baseball notes how my son was leading his college team in batting average and RBIs, which I showed to Luke, which he just shook his head. That's George. That's George. George stayed in touch, asked us to be our best selves, always encouraged us to do better, and always to remember never to leave or ignore the least of these, and not leave anybody behind. But see, as many of you have told stories about that, that wasn't just his personality, wasn't just his style. It was for him theological. Theological. It was out of his favorite text we used to discuss all the time, the 25th chapter of Matthew. We talked about that text over and over and over again. I call it the "it was me" text, where Jesus says, I was hungry. It was me. I was thirsty. I was naked. I was sick. I was a prisoner. I was a stranger. By the word stranger in the Greek means literally immigrant refugee. That's what it means. And George would say, Jim, the people that Jesus told us to protect, they're targeting those people. They're targeting those very people. For him, it was a matter of faith, not just of politics. And when people attacked the poor and the vulnerable, he wasn't just politically opposed, he was religiously indignant to what they were doing. So, we were together just a few months ago in Washington. Great dinner, gathered all the people, great conversation. Then I got the call from Tim. So I called him, and his voice, as you warned me, was different, was very weak. And you could tell he was bothered by how weak his voice was. You could tell it bothered him. He wanted to talk, but you could tell it bothered him that I was hearing his voice, because his voice was a great gift. One of the things he had was his voice. Always could lift that voice. And his voice was failing him. But he did say, and you're speaking at my memorial service. I said, yeah, George, I will whenever that happens, but it could be a long time. You might recover miraculously and write a book about it. He says, yeah, I would do that. I would do that. But George's voice will always be with us, because we're all here today, and many others would love to be here because we knew someone. We knew someone, and we're glad we did. His name was George Mitrovich. Don't worry, George, we're never going to forget your name. Now we'll keep dropping it the rest of our lives. We'll always remember you and be grateful for you, our friend, George Mitrovich.
Most gracious and loving God, we've come together to remember the life of George Mitrovich and to celebrate his life's journey in transforming the lives of others. To San Diego and Denver, it was a treasure. His absolute love of baseball, his undying love of his family, country, and his indefatigable efforts to ensure
that the common good of the Commonwealth would never be co-opted by the imperfections of politics, theology, or civility. George, most gracious one and loving one, was your worthy umpire. His endearing love of baseball, and especially of his Boston Red Sox, never went unnoticed, and his love of God and teachings of Jesus Christ were the true elements that defined his character and were exemplified by his engagement with the world and the people that surrounded him. And so we've gathered together, most loving God, to return his body and soul to you in thanksgiving for a life well lived. And we know that in your wisdom you are prepared to receive him, and that you have reserved for him a place in the heavenly dugout of what George often said was your favorite team, the Boston Red Sox. Amen.
God be with you till we meet again. By his counsels guide uphold you. With his sheep securely fold you. God be with you till we meet again. Till we meet, till we meet, till we meet at Jesus' feet. Till we meet, till we meet. God be with you till we meet again.
Following the conclusion of this celebration of George's life, you are all invited to gather in Linder Hall, which is just around the corner. And if you have a hard time finding it, there are many people who are wearing Red Sox hats who can direct you. I offer this blessing as I know God through my Jesus, while others experience his presence through Moses, the law, and the prophets, and others through the prophet Muhammad. And so on this day of celebration and on this day of giving back, may the blessing of God Almighty, who unites and does not divide, keep our hearts, minds, and souls in the knowledge of his unconditional love for all, both now and forever. Amen.